everyone. I'm Traci Arieli, end of life doula and founder of Comforting Closure. Welcome to another episode. Today, we're exploring a topic that's often misunderstood: medical assistance in dying, or medical aid in dying, depending on where you live, or just simply MAID. While MAID itself has been discussed before on this podcast, one area that often gets overlooked is the support needed by families and loved ones who are walking this journey alongside the person who has chosen this option. My guest today is Robin Farr, the program manager and a peer support volunteer for the MAID Family Support Society, a Canadian organization that offers peer support to families navigating this process. Robin's own experience supporting her father through MAID led her to this work, and she now helps others find comfort, connection, and guidance. We'll talk about Robin's personal journey, the mission of MAID Family Support, and the emotional and practical realities that families face. We'll also take a closer look at how MAID is handled in Canada, addressing common misconceptions, challenges, and the impact of peer support. So grab a warm drink, find a comfortable seat, and join us for the conversation. Robin, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
So can we start off and can you share your personal experience with MAID and how you became involved with the MAID Family Support Society?
Of course. So as you mentioned, my dad chose MAID, and he went through MAID. He died with the assistance of MAID in 2021, May 2021. So we're coming up to 4 years now. And he had mentioned to us, to his family, that he was thinking about this. There was one point, it was about 6 months before, and he threw it into an email, which was kind of how he communicated about hard things. And he said, you know, the palliative care nurse has mentioned some information about MAID, and I think it's time to start looking into it. And we went, well, what's MAID? And when he told us, I mean, my first response was, as I expect you would imagine, which is like that feeling of all of the air leaving the room and, you know, everything stopping for a moment. And I did not have that on my radar at all. So it came as a bit of a shock. But we were all in support of that, and we could understand why he might make that choice. He had something called interstitial lung disease. And as we went through the process of talking about this and his choice, he mentioned that he had heard that the natural death associated with that illness is essentially like suffocating to death. And he, of course, he didn't want that. It was probably 2 or 3 more times over the course of that 6 months period that he mentioned it again. But I think, like most daughters, I was firmly planted in denial, and I was assuming that MAID was much further down the road, and he was talking about way later. And so when he brought it up, we would say, sure, yeah, we understand that, we support that's all fine. And then what happened was, one day in May in 2021, my brother phoned and he said, Dad has made the decision to go ahead next week. And that's when the floor really fell away, and I was really, really surprised. And the process in terms of our response to that in the next few days was a little bit of a scramble. My youngest sister lives in a city that is well, it's about a 12-hour drive from here, but it's an hour plane ride. She had just had a baby. She had a 3-month-old baby. And it was in the middle of COVID still. We weren't sure if she was going to be able to get there. So we were having this conversation with him to say, can you just wait a little bit? Can we sort out some of the logistics, and can you wait a little bit? And he said, no, I'm ready to go. And we respected that. So we got all our ducks in a row. My sister did manage to get here. I have another sister who was in Australia at the time, and they were in the middle of a lockdown. She could not get here. And my first response, I'm the sort of person who likes to know what to expect with things. So I started Googling and didn't come across very much. And I was looking at, how does this work and what do I tell my kids and things like that. Couldn't find a lot. So I decided I'm not spending my dad's last week Googling things. So I just sort of let it go and went ahead and did the things that he wanted and needed to do in the last week. And then we were all with him on the day that he died. So he went ahead the following Thursday. Me, my brother, 2 of my sisters were in the room. My sister in Australia was with us in Zoom. And we were there when he died. And, I remember I with as much delicacy as I can, I will say, I share people that my response to that day was I woke up really early that morning and I threw up.
Mm.
And I just remember feeling, I never had felt that way before. It was just awful. And you're going in and you know exactly what time it is. It's 2 o'clock. And, I had been counting up to that day. We've got 3 more days, we've got 2 more days. And all of a sudden the day was there and we had, a matter of hours. And we didn't know what to expect. We didn't have any idea. We just had to sort of go with it. So we went and took him the lunch that he had requested and spent some time with him that day. And then the provision went ahead at 2 o'clock. And I just remember coming into that room and even walking out of it and thinking, there's got to be more support than this. This is just, it's not okay. And the doctor who did the MAID provision, they were lovely. The doctor and the nurse that were there, they were lovely. And one of the last things that this doctor said to my dad, she said, "Don't worry about them," pointing to us. And she said, "We'll take care of them." And I thought, oh, thank goodness. I wonder what that looks like. Well, it looked like a pamphlet. And so she handed me this pamphlet. And really, you've got to be kidding me, was sort of the thing that went through my head again. But it actually turned out to be a good thing, because one of the things that was listed on that pamphlet was a Facebook group for
Mm.
another organization, not ours, but a sister organization of ours, who has a Facebook group for people whose loved one has chosen MAID. And I went home and I got onto Facebook and I had a look at that and found just stories of other people who had been through it. And I just remember that feeling of relief washing over me and thinking, okay, this is a horrible thing, but I'm not the only one who's ever been through it, even though, when you're doing something hard, it can feel that way. Um, and I felt a whole lot better. And then in the course of the next few days or so, a couple of weeks maybe, there was a call out for volunteers for the organization that I now volunteer with. And they were looking for volunteers. And I already had it in my head that I needed to be part of fixing this problem and this lack of support for people. So I got in touch with them. In fact, I found the other day, I found my first email exchange with our founder. And I said, I'm interested in volunteering. And this, by the time we got around to talking about it, it was probably August. So it was still fairly fresh. And she said, "Are you sure? Like, this is pretty recent." And I said, "Nope, like, put me in, coach. We're going to fix this problem. This has got to get better."
Mm.
And 3.5 years later, here I am, very involved in the organization and feeling like we're making that gap a little bit smaller for people.
Now, you mentioned before that before your father's death, that you really hadn't heard of MAID, and through your father's choice, how did that change your perspective on end of life choices?
Well, it was interesting because it went from theoretical to very practical, obviously. So
Yeah.
I recall this would have been when I was in high school, probably. There was a court case in Canada. The woman's name was Sue Rodriguez. She was the one who really pushed for this to become legal. That's how it became legal in Canada. It wasn't through a simple change of legislation. It's been through court cases that the legislation has changed. And I remember at the time thinking, yeah, of course, like, that makes a ton of sense to me. And I was on the debate team in high school, and one of the debates that we had to address was the concept of euthanasia, as it was called then, which is a word we do not use now. But I argued very vehemently on the pro side of that. So I remember all of my life feeling like I understood the concept, I understood the rationale, even if in a very theoretical sense. So I did not know that it had actually become legal in Canada. In fact, if you had asked me, I actually probably would have assumed it had been legal for much longer, but it became legal in Canada in 2016. So at that point, we were 5 years down the road. So when he said this, I had no real hesitation about whether I would support his choice. But it was more a matter of, why are you choosing this now? And like I said, I had imagined that it was way down the road, and all of a sudden it was in front of my face. And we go through these sort of, I think, fairly natural thought processes where we think, did I not support him enough? Is he
Mm.
depressed? Is there something else going on? And we had to work through a lot of that. But it really came to be clear that and through that conversation too, about asking him to delay and him choosing not to, that he was really ready to go. And it was actually the night before he died. We were all in his long-term care room. And we were, telling stories and laughing, and it was actually a lovely, lovely evening. But towards the end of the evening, he took an Ativan, which, was one of the things that they have prescribed as part of this process, just to sort of, I imagine it's a little bit, anxiety invoking, even if you're making the choice. And he was fine, and then he was getting ready to go to bed, and we were having to help him. And it was that night I really realized, oh, he's worse off than I thought, and maybe he was hiding it a little bit. But he just, his quality of life was not great, and he was ready to go. And that really cemented for me that this is an important choice for people to have. And then, of course, through the volunteer work that I've done, I've talked to a lot of people, and a lot of people sort of secondhand through our volunteer stories about the experiences of people who choose MAID. And they all choose it for similar reasons, pain and suffering, lack of quality of life, all of those things. And I didn't want him to suffer. I would never have wanted that. I would never have wanted him to delay or extend, really, for my sake. Once we kind of got over it, that was really clear to all of us. And I look at these stories of people, and I think, thank goodness this is legal in Canada, and they can make this choice, and they can die on their own terms with dignity and not suffer.
Yeah. I feel the same way here about that choice. I mean, really, one of the things that I find so important in the work that I do is that quality of life. And so that's really what I talk about. I mean, I know that the term death doula is really popular. I prefer end of life doula because I'm looking at, hey, that last part of life and what is that quality of life. And so I always have those discussions when people are making decisions about what is really important, what are a person's values, and at what point
Yeah.
do you just say, okay, I'm past that point. My quality of life isn't there. I talk to many families that ask me, can you please talk to, the person who's sick, just to really, we want to know if they're ready or not.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it is all around quality of life. Let's talk about MAID Family Support Society. What is your mission? What's the mission of MAID Family Support?
Sure. So our mission is very clear. We're supported on, families and loved ones, and we're here to provide lived experience, support, and connection to people who have a loved one going through MAID, or who has chosen that. So they are grieving someone who's been lost to MAID. And we are here, like I say, that lived experience piece is really important. We provide peer support as people who have been through it.
And so it's pre and post.
It is. It's really whenever they find us. And some people find us, quite a long time in advance. There are people who choose to apply and get assessed for MAID, but may not, choose a date right away. And so we may be in touch with them for quite a long time. We may be in touch with them right before, or they may be finding us after. We keep statistics on this. We used to find that people were finding us more after than before, which is fine, but really, we're wanting to make sure we're here when people need us, and many people are looking for that support in advance. We've done a lot of outreach over the last couple of years, and now those statistics are flipping. We're seeing people finding us now more in advance, which is great. I talk about what I, based on my own experience, what I call the oh crap moment, when somebody is, telling you that they've chosen MAID, and you go, oh my God, what, okay, I have to figure out what's next. And that's the piece that we're trying to alleviate a little bit for people, is that they have somewhere to turn. And so many of them turn to us, and they come in and they say, okay, I have this, relative, friend, whoever it is, who is choosing MAID. Help, what do I do with this? How do I manage this? And that's the piece that we're really trying to manage, is whether it's before or after or both, whether it's one phone call or five, whatever the case might be that they need. That's what we try to manage.
And what does that support look like?
It sort of depends. Well, it largely depends on what the person themselves is looking for. So we find people are largely looking for one of two things. One is just somebody to talk to who has been there. As anyone knows who has been through something hard, whatever it is, it's so much easier to deal with when you feel like you're less alone in that. When you feel like you're alone, or you don't have anyone to turn to, or nobody can relate, that makes the the challenging experience even harder. And so that's a big piece, is they just want to talk to somebody who has been through it. Like I said, MAID's been legal in Canada since 2016, so we are now at about 9 years, but many people still don't know somebody who has been through MAID, or who has had a relative go through MAID. And so they don't have somebody to talk to who has been through what we've all been through. So we or they're really to talk about that, and share whatever we can to support them. The other thing people are often looking for is just somebody to ask questions. And that, would have been my situation for sure. And those questions, as you can imagine, are really wide ranging. But a lot of the common ones are, what to expect, how do you prepare for the day, and one of the biggest questions that is something we hear over and over again from people is, how do I make my loved ones' last months or weeks or days as good as possible? What do I do to support them during that time? So people reach out to us for support, and our first question usually is what's the biggest need that you have? What are you looking for from us? And we sort of go from there.
Let's talk about some of the barriers to medical aid and dying. In the United States, only 10 of our states and the District of Columbia allow MAID. And I know that Vermont and Oregon, they actually allow non-residents to come in and to choose that method to die. And then for us, there's a cost because insurance and Medicare doesn't take care of this. So for the actual medication, it's anywhere between $3,000 and $5,000. And that doesn't include doctors. The doctors aren't covered by insurance also. And we have to have at least 2 meetings with our doctors. So it's really expensive. In Canada, how accessible is MAID for individuals? And are there any barriers?
Sure. So as you can imagine, as you probably know, the situation in Canada is very different. So in Canada, it is legal across the country. It is federal legislation, so it does not vary by province. In Canada, you have to be living within Canada and or really eligible for Canadian healthcare is really what it is. So, there are places like Switzerland where people can go to receive MAID. Canada's not like that. You have to be eligible here. And essentially, when you go through this process, there's for each province, it's a slightly different process because healthcare is provincially managed in Canada. So each province sets up their own process for people who want to access MAID. But generally, there's an application form of some sort that people can access. Then, regardless of where you are, there's 2 medical assessments that have to be undergone by 2 independent medical practitioners. It can be a doctor or a nurse practitioner. And then, if somebody is found eligible for MAID, they can then choose to receive it. And the medication that is required for that, the assessments, all of that is covered by our healthcare system. So there's no additional cost to this at all. They can access MAID wherever they like, with some exceptions, and that's one of the barriers I'll mention. But really, I would say that it's really accessible for people who meet the criteria. There are safeguards in place, and one of the challenges that some people have is where they can access MAID. So there are certain hospices that are often backed by Catholic-run facilities that will not allow MAID to happen on their premises, in which case people have to move elsewhere, which in Canada and under the sort of the MAID advocacy world is termed a forced transfer, because many of the people who are very ill do not want to be having to move right before they die. So there are a few things like that, but otherwise it's pretty accessible. Like I say, if you meet the criteria, and I think it's really well managed in Canada. It's a with certain outliers, I'm sure it's a fairly smooth process.
And the criteria, like our criteria, is you have to be terminally ill or terminal within the next 6 months. 2 doctors have to interview you. I know in California, it's the first interview, and then 24 hours or 48 hours is the second interview. I think in other states, it could be up to 2 weeks for that second interview. But you also have to be able to self-administer So you don't
Mhm.
get help from the doctor at all, which with people with ALS or something like that, that makes it really difficult. Do you have those same kind of legal requirements?
We do have some of those similar legal requirements, but some of them are different. So in Canada, and I'll qualify with the fact that I'm not a MAID expert, but I can share the criteria as outlined by our legislation, which is that the person has to be 18 years of age, regardless of which province they're in. Like I say, eligible for government-funded healthcare in Canada. They have to make a voluntary request, so it can't be through external pressure. And if it appears as though somebody is pressuring this person to apply, then that becomes an issue, obviously. They have to give informed consent to MAID. They have to be, in possession of all of the information about MAID in terms of what the options are, what their alternative options are, for other forms of healthcare or palliative care or anything like that has to all be presented so that they can make an informed decision to go ahead with MAID. Like I say, they have to have 2 independent medical assessments, but there's no timeline on that anymore. There used to be, but that was changed in one of our recent updates to the legislation. So you can actually have this on, you can have them on the same day and die that same day. It is
Wow.
rare, I would think, but there are cases where that happens. And the language in our legislation is you have to have a grievous and irremediable condition. And so there are some very specific criteria that go with that, which is they have to have a serious illness, disease, or disability, which does not include mental illness as a sole underlying condition. So that's one of the exceptions to that. Um, the person has to be in an advanced state of decline that cannot be reversed through treatment or healthcare options. And they have to be in what is called an unbearable state of physical or mental suffering, as a result of their illness or disease and that state of decline. And so the doctors will make that assessment, or the medical practitioners will make that assessment, and then they will determine if that person is eligible. At the moment, the only other time restriction is we have what we call a 2-track system. So in the legislation in Canada, MAID is available if death is reasonably foreseeable, with no time limit. If it is not reasonably foreseeable, in the opinion of those medical practitioners who do the assessment, then they can still access MAID on what we call track 2. But those medical assessments must take at least 90 days. So there has to be a bit of a waiting period in there in order for people to make sure that this is really the appropriate thing. In terms of the administration of this, it can be self-administered, but a very, very, very small percentage of MAID in Canada is done by self-administration. It's mostly done by a medical practitioner. So they will come in Canada, it's generally done through an injection. So the first thing that they do is they will come and start an IV. They'll put those lines in, and then the medication is administered through those lines through an injection.
What are some of the other challenges that families face when they're going through this? Besides what we just mentioned.
Yeah. So, I think that there are a lot of common challenges for people. Really coming to terms with the decision is the biggest one. There are logistical challenges around going through the process and getting the assessment done and managing all of that. For some people, that's very smooth. For others, depending on their illness, it can be a little bit more complicated. But once you get to the point where that person has been assessed and found eligible, then people are in the position of having to come to terms with that decision. And really sorting out what's happening in terms of timing and all of that kind of stuff, when and where and all those sorts of things. Um, with the people that talk to us and that reach out to us, many people are looking for just a way to process this. It's been a number of years now. I wish I could figure out a better way to express what this is, but it's that coming to terms with the person having made this decision to die on their own terms. It's not suicide. We do not call it assisted suicide in Canada. And yet, people have those questions about, why is this happening? Why are they choosing this? And going through all of that process. There are obviously some very complicated things that can come with this. There are certain, families where there are religious or faith-based concerns or objections. And, we talk to families where there is conflict within the family about that in terms of whether or not this is quote unquote right, or should be allowed. Sometimes it's just a question of the timing, like with this example of my dad and us wanting him to wait and him being determined that a week from now was the time. You have to come to terms with that, the choice that they have made and the time that they have chosen, regardless of when that is. That can be a tough one. Another one is just whether to tell others. People, there's still, stigma against this in some communities, in some areas, and people have to figure out whether they're going to make it known that this person chose to die by MAID. Some do, some don't, and I have no judgment either way on that. It's just a question of what's right for them and their family.
Yeah. Are there any misconceptions about, are there any misconceptions about MAID that you'd like to address?
Yeah, there's a few. There's, if you were to Google MAID, you'd find a bunch of histrionic, kind of conversations around this, and people making a big to-do out of things that they consider inappropriate. There's one American, I think he's an anesthesiologist, who has criticized the way that MAID is administered in Canada, and then has accused the process of involving drowning, which is really not true. In fact, this has been studied. There have been people who have been studied after they've chosen MAID, and there have been no effects on lungs or anything found. There's this sort of general, some of the conversation in Canada around this is a concern that people are being offered MAID as an alternative to appropriate social, emotional, or health support. And again, that's not the case. If somebody does not have, if they're unhoused or they have, limited social resources, whatever the case might be, they cannot qualify for MAID. Those are not criteria under the legislation. And that is something that I think people need to understand is there are quite strict criteria. And there's a process that people have to go through. So, I have heard a lot about this and people talking about how people that receive MAID suffer, that it's a painful process or that it's like drowning or any of the other, things that are thrown out there about it. And that was not my experience at all. It was not the experience of anyone that I've talked to, and there have been hundreds now through our organization. It's a very peaceful process, and I think that's something that's really important for people to know.
You spoke about within families, sometimes there being that conflict. Some people are very supportive, and I've talked to and I've interviewed people where they had to keep it quiet from half the family. Mm-hmm. What do you say to individuals who feel conflicted about one's choice, about this choice, and how do you? So that's one part of it. So we'll talk about that first.
Yeah. So I think, I have pretty strong feelings about this. Our organization is not necessarily, we're actually very clearly not an advocacy organization. We will talk to people regardless of how they feel about this. And really, we're just here to talk through the experience of having someone choose this and go through this process. Personally, I'm a big advocate of it. Obviously, we've talked about that. I've had the experience with my dad. The one thing that I keep going back to, and it's interesting, it's a conversation that I had with one of our volunteers, who's a reverend. She has a role. She's a hospital chaplain, and she does a lot of these things in this area. And we were talking about this at one point as a group and said, what do you say when people come forward and say, this is wrong, God wouldn't want this, the only one who can, take a life is God. And she said, would God want that person to suffer? And I keep coming back to that because it really, to me, and people may feel differently, but to me, it's as simple as that. Is, what is the best thing for your person? How do they, make that choice, and how can you support them in that choice? And if you are, struggling with this, and if there's a personal challenge around this choice for you, that's okay. It's not uncommon. But, I usually tell people, talk to somebody else. That's what we're here for. Bring it up, talk through it with someone. and find a way to manage your concerns, and then show up for that person, be there for them in whatever way that they need.
Are there is there any other advice that you can give to someone whose loved one is considering MAID as far as support, how to show up?
Yeah, I think listening with compassion is a big thing. Creating a space for those conversations, open and judgment free as much as you can. Listen to people. If there are others in the family who have concerns, listen and try to come to a way of letting people feel heard while still allowing the person to make their own independent choice. Um, Educate yourself about MAID to understand how it works and understand the process and how you can support your loved one so that you are comfortable with things as they proceed. Um, a big thing is really, it's important to acknowledge your own emotions, your own feelings around this, but respect that person's autonomy. Like I said, it has to be a choice that they make for themselves. They're asked for consent a number of times, including right. The very last thing the doctor did was ask my dad for consent to go ahead. And so that's really the choice that they have made. But really, reach out for support. That's what, our organization is here for, is to talk to people about this so that they're not struggling with it on their own.
And I know that you went over before some of the emotional challenges
Mhm.
that families could expect. Can you just repeat some of those, just so people could be really,
Sure.
can really see those and be prepared? So, what emotional challenges should families prepare for, both before and after the MAID procedure?
Mhm. Yeah, so I mean, before, there's the piece about coming to terms with the decision, and that's the biggest challenge that I think people have. I still have days almost 4 years later where I
Mm.
kind of go back over this and think about whether we could have done anything differently, and have to sort of reinforce that, it was his choice and he made the right choice for him. Um, Leading up to that day is, it was an awful experience for me. It's hard for a lot of people. Um, be prepared for it to be hard, but figure out how you want to manage that. Talk about, what you need to do with the person in their last days. Have you said all the things that you need to say? Have they done the things that they need to do or say? Um, how is it going to take place? How and when and where? And is there anything, particular or special that you want to include in that process for yourself or for that person, but depending on what they might want. Um, One of the big ones for me is, a lot of people seem to think that grief after MAID should be easier because you knew that it was coming. And it's not. And in fact, it's really profoundly not easier. And I was a little bit taken aback by that. Even though we had a short period of time, I didn't expect the grief to be the way that it was. And that can be a really challenging piece. But even the piece leading up to it, when I came across the term anticipatory grief, it crystallized something for me where all of a sudden I thought, oh, that's what that is. Because obviously, like, if somebody is ill and you know that they are going to pass away because they have a terminal illness, that's coming at some point. You may not know when. And people go through that process of anticipatory grief. That was a really helpful term for me to understand. Um, as you get sort of past the MAID provision, um, things around relief and guilt can be really complicated. I still struggled with that, even though we had addressed that with my dad. Like, again, should I have done anything differently? Could we have made his life easier or better? Um, or for some caregivers that are really in it every day in terms of a caregiving role, that relief of not having that anymore, and just, having that burden lifted can be really challenging. It's a perfectly valid emotion, but it's a tough thing to wrestle with for sure. And for those people where the choice to not mention MAID is important for them because of their family, their community, whatever the case might be. That can make people feel a little bit isolated and unsupported because there's this sort of big cloud hanging over something that they can't share. And that can be a really big thing as well.
Yeah. I love that you talked about the challenges of being that caretaker also. I can't, every single person, there's two things that are universal when I work with people who are grief. The first one is, am I doing this right? And there's no right or wrong way to do grief. It just, you don't have control of it. It just is something that you are going to go through, and it doesn't go away. I mean, you will deal with it in some form or another your entire life. But the second thing is, every single person who is a caretaker feels guilty because they felt relief. That they didn't have to be a caretaker anymore. Every single caretaker.
Yep. It's a pretty universal thing for sure.
Speaking about caretaking and taking care of yourself, the job that you do is very emotional, or can be very emotional. And it's not the typical 9 to 5. Right? How do you take care of yourself? How do you make sure you're okay through doing this work?
Well, a number of things, and just so that we're clear too, this is actually not my 9 to 5. I have a 9 to 5 job outside of this, and that's a whole other thing. So this is a largely volunteer role on top of that. It's the same as, what I have found for everything that, and I am old enough now that I have done it the wrong way and not taken care of myself and had to learn those lessons the hard way, the way that, humans tend to do. And I have figured out what works for me. And, I have, the habits that are important to me: exercise. I have a dog who is, a great source of comfort in general, but we walk every day, and that fresh air, that time outside is really important. Time with my family, that sort of thing. The thing that I love about our organization is we have a really fantastic community. The people are just lovely, and it can be great to talk to other people about what they're experiencing and what they're finding. We have a monthly meeting with our volunteers on Zoom every month, and we have about almost 80 volunteers now, and a good chunk of them show up. And we talk about the things that people have been dealing with and the support requests that they have had. And we talk through those. And, if you have a question about whether you said something the right way, or whether you responded in the right way, or if you just need to talk through something that was challenging, they're there. And we also have a debrief team. So we have a couple of people who are retired social workers, and they act as debriefers for our volunteers. So we ask people to debrief the first few support requests that they take, just so that they can talk through it and make sure nothing came up for them, anything like that. And then they're just there if needed. And I actually called upon them at one point. I had a request from somebody who had a very similar situation to my dad, and it was in advance of MAID. So I sort of relived the whole process of leading up to that through talking to her and all of that. And I came out of that thinking, oh my gosh, that was a lot. And I really had to figure out how to manage that. So I contacted one of our debrief team members, and spent an hour on the phone crying with her and talking through. And she said all the things that you need to hear, which is, it's normal, and this is good that you're doing this, and it's not unusual that you might be triggered in this way, and all of those things that intellectually, but emotionally you just sort of need that reinforcement. And that was really helpful for me. And then I just took a deep breath, and I was okay after that. But we have had team members who are who've been with us for a while, who have done a number of these things over and over, and something just gets you sometimes, and that's what they're there for. So I take advantage of our community when needed, on top of the things that I do on my own.
Thank you. Now, last question. If you could share one piece of wisdom or reassurance with families facing this journey, what would it be?
Oh, that's such a big question.
Yes.
But I actually think the answer is probably really simple, which is to say that your loved one has made this choice. They're dying on their own terms in a way that is right for them, and it will be okay.
Thank you. Robin, thank you so much for, first of all, sharing your story on the show, and for being here and giving all this great information.
Thank you for having me. It's been lovely.
Now, before we go, can you tell people how they can learn more about the MAID Family Support Society and how they can help?
For sure, yeah. So we have a website that you can go to. We have a lot of information on there. It's maidfamilysupport.ca. Google MAID Family Support Society, you will find us. We have, information and resources on there for people who want to learn about MAID in Canada or what we do or what support is available. We also have social accounts, so you can follow us, MAID Family Support, on Facebook. Where are we now? Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, and YouTube. We have a YouTube channel where we have some short digital stories. Mine is one of them, from some of our volunteers that we made in conjunction with an organization in Canada that creates those, and some researchers who were looking at this. So there's lots of interesting things that you can find that you can browse around with. We've also published a book if people are interested in learning more about MAID and people's experiences. We have a book called The Many Faces of MAID. And it's 17 people's experiences. Again, I'm one of them, experiences with MAID. So you can buy that book. It's available. And I meant to check before this. It's available on Amazon Canada. I can't recall offhand if it's in the US, but it is out there. So you can buy that book to support us, or there's a donation link on our website. We are a registered Canadian charity, and we do take donations. And in fact, that's our main source of keeping going right now. We don't have any funding from outside, or federal funding, or government funding. So we are reliant on our many generous donors to keep going.
Great. And I'll put all of those links down, including the link to your donation page, and hopefully the link to, a page in Amazon, because I do believe that it is available in America also, that book.
Yeah. It's a good book. I say that as somebody who was in it, but there are some really helpful stories in there if people want to know what it's like to go through this with someone.
Thank you. Listeners, this conversation has been an important reminder that no one should have to navigate end-of-life decisions alone. Whether you agree with MAID or not, supporting a loved one through this process can be deeply emotional and complicated. However, organizations like MAID Family Support Society show us that there's comfort in connection, shared experiences, and knowing that someone truly understands what you're going through. Thank you for joining us. If you have any questions, please comment below or reach out to me directly. And if you found this conversation to be helpful, please like, share, comment, and subscribe. This is Traci Arieli from Comforting Closure, wishing you peace and comfort in your journey. Until next time, take care.